What's up and welcome into the top 10 deadliest opening traps in the Rousseau Gambit, which is probably the most brutal way to counter the Italian game. You're challenging them and there are literally traps at every turn. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov and let's dive right into it. Now, once you challenge their sender, they'll usually see that there is a free pawn and they'll be thinking, hey, why not to capture it? But it's not a free pawn, it's a bait, and if they accept it, they're going to suffer. Luckily for you, most of your pawns will do just that. Right on the next move, you push this pawn forward, and at this very moment, they'll realize that something is not going their way, because this knight does not have any convenient squares to go to. Your queen takes away these two squares along this diagonal, while your knight takes away the central squares. Therefore, what can they do if they wish to save this knight? Moving it back to g1 just feels very passive, moving it back to its original square, and some of your opponents will try to be tricky and to play queen e2, where not only they attack this pawn, but they are also pin it down to your king, and so they're trying to get away with this little tactics. But you do just that, you play queen e7, a symmetric move, unpinning the pawn and therefore renewing the threat to the knight. Therefore, they have nothing left to do but to ultimately get it back to where it started, all the way back to g1. Now you just play knight to f6, bringing your knight into play and getting ready to play d5 to hit this bishop. At this point, they realize that they still can't develop normally, because this knight still can't go here, they can't castle because the knight is right there, and they play d3, which is the most played move in this position, hoping for you to trade off pawns, which would allow them to trade queens and basically get away with no danger into an endgame with an extra pawn. But of course, we've got something else in mind. This is one of the most beautiful traps of this gambit. Maybe you have seen it before, but anyway, it's beautiful, and we'll go into more hidden and less known stuff just in a moment. Instead of taking this pawn, you've got an unpleasant surprise. You play knight d4 with a counter strike. This hits the queen, and the queen can't easily move away, as it also needs to guard this pawn on c2, because from there your knight is gonna also fork their king and rook. And therefore, if they move the queen anywhere, either to d1 or to d2, doesn't matter, it seems that it defends this pawn, but you nevertheless capture it with knight takes c2, still delivering this fork. And if they take the knight, that leads to pawn takes d3, and at this point they'll realize a very annoying thing. When they try putting this move on the board, the system will keep returning it back with that annoying sound, and they'll realize that their king is under a check. Therefore, they have no time to save their queen, and they're losing the game. Of course, some people will think, okay, that's just a single trick, right? And white simply played d3, which was indeed a blunder, even though the most played move by white, and that led to knight to d4 with a total devastation. But what about white just playing any other move? Well, there aren't that many options, honestly, because this knight can go here, d3 is a blunder, so let's say they go knight c3, which is indeed the second most played move. Does it mean that white is now out of danger? Not at all. This is a very classical Igor Nation stuff. Your opponents don't know the Rousseau Gambit yet, but they're about to learn it the hard way. You still play knight to d4, showing them that this queen e2 idea was actually wrong, just a waste of time, letting you bring the knight into play with a tempo, hits the queen, still hits this pawn on c2, so they have to go back to d1. And now there is an interesting idea. Normally in such positions, you'd love to play d5. That gains a tempo, hits the bishop, enables you to capture this pawn while developing your bishop. Everything would be just fine. But there's a problem. If you play d5 straight away, white's got two attackers of this square while you have only one defender. Therefore, it seems to be impossible, but you surprise your opponent by playing this move anyway. This simply allows you to keep attacking with a tempo, kind of like Mikhail Tal, without ever slowing down. This hits the bishop, they gotta do something, so let's say they trade, and after the trade, you then bring your bishop out. Now, you are ahead in development, they only have one bishop developed, mostly they're totally passive, while you are already generating threats. One of them might be to still insist on this knight takes c2 idea. You can just push this pawn forward, which would open up a diagonal for your bishop and would make knight takes c2 possible. There is also another threat that is hidden. Plus, if your opponent doesn't do anything constructive, you can even castle queenside and gain one more tempo hitting this bishop. What can your opponent play in this position? A very natural move, knight to e2, developing a knight and challenging your knight in the center, surprisingly fails to bishop g4, which pins the knight down to the queen and also attacks it because it is attacked twice, and there is no way out for white. Moreover, it's not just a knight, because once you grab it, you're also going to capture the queen on d1, and that is really bad for white. Which brings white to an idea of playing pawn c3 first, kicking your knight away, and then completing their development in a simple and comfortable fashion. This move, however, also fails to a tactical motif known as something like that, or a nightmare. Knight to f3 check. We're not going to go back. You keep attacking, you keep coming, and whether they take this knight by their knight or pawn, this opens up this discover check to their king, and if the king tries to run, this fails pretty nicely to bishop d3, which is almost a checkmate as you control all the squares around the king. They would have to give up the knight, but now you can capture it anyhow you want, and it is a very simple win, for example, like this. Here's the best part. What if your opponent realizes that he can't move the king away because of this check, and he just offers you the knight? Should you simply take it and accept this trade, or is there anything better? I'll give you a couple seconds so that you can find it on your own, and this Rousseau Gambit is super tricky. By the way, while you're thinking, just a quick announcement that if you ever wanted to get a simple, clear blueprint for chess improvement, then today's the day. Up to the 1st of December, we're running Black Friday offers with a massive discounts up to 80% off on any of my premium courses. So if you felt like you've been stuck for a while or your results are inconsistent and you wish to improve but you don't have that much time to allocate for chess, I'll be happy to help. We have these courses designed mainly for adult amateurs so that you can have this clear step-by-step guide for improvement with theory, practice, and everything that you need. So you can click the link below the video in the description and see if there's anything that you like. Back to the game, the winning move is bishop to c2. We're not gonna just trade, we wish to deflect the queen, and as the queen moves, that leads to this nice cozy checkmate. Is there anything else that your opponent can do? Of course. Now, still, most players would capture this pawn, and after e4, so far we covered their attempt to play queen e2, pinning your pawn, and as we have seen, it's actually a step in the wrong direction, it fails. Now, most of your opponents will simply retreat their knight back to g1, and at this point you can obviously suggest them to also bring the bishop back and try it again in the next game, but there is a nice thing that you can do right here. You can play pawn to d5, which is guarded by the queen, so they can't take it. It allows you to win a tempo, because now they have to also move the bishop. Previously, you won a tempo by kicking the knight out. Now you win one more tempo for kicking the bishop out. And once the bishop moves anywhere, you could then just simply take this pawn on f5, and that would already perfectly justify your gambit. You've got strong center, you push them around, everything's cool. But there is a move that is even stronger. You can take advantage of the fact that this knight is awkward on g1 and play queen g5, all of a sudden hitting this pawn and indirectly the rook in the corner. In this position, most players trade on c6. It wasn't really called for, but anyway, that only helps you, so why not? Now, they need to guard this pawn as well as this pawn. What can they do? If they try to just move the king, I mean, it does get the job done, but after this, the king gets stuck right here, they can't castle anymore, and certainly is very good for you. If they play g3, that permanently weakens all these light squares around their king. And yeah, I mean, you'll just grab this pawn, keep developing, you know, your knight, the bishop, castle, king sides. Life's good. You have a very simple attack after that. Now, the idea which may came to their mind to guard both of these pawns, the f5 as well as the g2 pawn, is to play g4. Now, this pawn is guarded, as well as this pawn is guarded on g4, and it feels like maybe now you are somewhat uncomfortable. They're hoping for some d3 stuff, you know, with this discover attacks, but as always, we've got something prepared. Even though they're mistakenly thinking that they guarded this pawn, you're going to blow up their defense by sacrificing the bishop, which also hits this pawn, and after the bishop is accepted, you then go queen g2 anyway. And the idea is now you're going to grab this rook in the corner, and from there also keep attacking their knight and king and whatnot. And basically that is it. There's no defense for white. They may try to go for this counterattack, this check, but it doesn't really change anything. You just move the king away, and their main problem remains to be the same. If they try queen f7, desperately hoping for some sort of counter tricks, there are many ways to deal with this. Of course, we're not going to blunder the bishop. You can play knight h6, for instance, which attacks the queen as well as guards this bishop. If they wish to keep attacking with queen e6, again, really there are many ways for you to win this game, but the nicest is to go bishop d6 to block this way of attack for their queen. And then after basically whatever move of white, I mean, they're defenseless, they can't guard the rook anyway, so whatever they do, you could take the rook, but even stronger is to play rook e8, and all of a sudden this queen on e6 is actually trapped. Notice that they can't throw this check because it's also guarded by your queen, so they're going to lose the queen, and then lose the rook, and maybe also the knight, and it's a total devastation. Moving on to the next trap, this time we're going to see a trap from the side of your opponent, a trap for white. Now, as we know, this knight could go back to g1, but it's just very passive and really good for you. Queen e2 is just bad, it actually backfires. There is a nice move knight d4, which sacrifices a knight, and if you accept it, this is exactly where their trap is going to come into play. Now, the solution is pretty simple, just don't accept it, alright? But anyway, you gotta be aware of, so I'm gonna show you the trap. If you lightheartedly accept this gambit, which is wrong, this allows them to play queen h5 with something similar to Scholar's checkmate, and you're in trouble. Even though you could play g6, temporarily blocking the file, but of course they can just capture it, still threatening all sorts of discover checks. And this counter strike does not help because your opponent believes in reincarnation, they're willing to sacrifice the queen and then to get a new one, while also grabbing your rook in the corner, and now you're in trouble. Your king is vulnerable, this queen is ready to take here with all sorts of threats all around, together with the bishop. It's quite uncomfortable, and actually white is winning here. With that being said, it's very simple to stop this. Since we know that they're going to play queen h5 check, you can stop it by playing knight f6, the move you were going to play anyway, just for your development, but simultaneously it also takes control of this square. Now their knight on d4 is still hanging, they're going to probably trade right here, and after that, whatever they do, let's say they castle, you play d5. Usually if you could achieve a position like that, it means that you already outplayed your opponent. The bishop needs to move somewhere, then you can bring your bishop out and get back your sacrificed pawn, and life's beautiful. You're totally dominating here, you've got really strong center, nice development. After whatever they do, you also develop the bishop, you castle kingside, and you have very nice position with a lot of opportunities to attack on the king side in the middle game. Before we move on to the next trap, let me quickly address the elephant in the room, because someone would write in comments, Igor, it's all good, but Stockfish says that the Rousseau Gambit is trash. Well, it's only true if you're playing against a sort of perfect chess human, like a child of Magnus Carlsen and Zhu Wenjun who was raised listening to Nakamura's streams instead of lullabies. Bottom line, I would not stress over computer's evaluation too much. It's really tricky. To give you an idea, the best move for white here is pawn to d4, which is the most challenging move, and it was only played by 10% of white players. In simple words, in 9 games out of 10, white could not find the correct response here. So again, you've got great chances here. Even if they happen to find the best move, it's far from over after that. It remains to be super tricky, and I'll show you a couple ideas that you can use in this case. One of them is to tempt them in this position after take, knight takes e5. We're not going to trade here. We're going to play d5, tempting them to play queen h5 check. Because we know that in some variations it actually wins for white. But in this case, it looks winning, but it turns out to be losing, even though the refutation is absolutely phenomenal. At first looks like it's check if the king moves, queen f7 checkmate, that's what your opponent is hoping for. g6 does not seem to help because there is the standard sacrifice knight takes g6, which totally exposes your king, plus this pawn is pinned, therefore looks like you're totally destroyed. You played some trash opening, you're destroyed. So what do you do then? You fight back with knight to f6 counter strike. They have no time for any checks because the queen is hanging. Moreover, they need to maintain this pin. If the queen just retreats somewhere back, you're going to take this knight. Therefore, they need to go somewhere here, as that's the only available square. I mean, this square is taken, this square is taken. Therefore, queen h4 is the only way for them to maintain this pin. But then you keep counter striking. You play knight takes d4. You don't care about your rook, you go for the all-out counterattack. And that leads to a couple really beautiful variations. Now, knight takes d4 aims to capture this pawn, delivering check to the king and rook. In most cases, they will notice this, and they'll try to guard the pawn by going bishop b3, which looks like an ideal solution, because first off, they remove this bishop from danger, secondly, they guard this pawn. So it looks like they perfectly consolidated their position. But there is this move knight to f5, which keeps chasing the queen away. And remember, our idea is to kick it out and then to grab this knight. Now they could play queen h3, still maintaining the pin. But we keep our round trip, we go knight to e7, this time opening up this sudden discovered attack, and after the queen goes anywhere, and this time doesn't matter where it goes, you can now grab this knight, but not with a pawn, but with your own knight. And that wins the knight, you keep attacking, you've got a great position. Some of your opponents at this point will not retreat, but will think, okay, I'm gonna bite the bullet and just grab this rook on h8. In this case, you counter-strike, as you were going to, with a check and attack of this rook, and actually your opponent has a lot of problems in this position. If they just move the king, you could capture this bishop because the rook cannot run away, and you're going to grab the rook. This knight on h8 is actually in sort of trouble as well, because you want to play bishop g7, and you can see that the knight has no way out. Therefore, you've got a bunch of threats here, and you are already up a piece. I mean, assuming that this rook is going to be captured on the next move. Moreover, if they try to be aggressive and play something like bishop g5, you know, trying to attack you right here, that actually fails to queen d1, sneaky checkmate. There is also one more way for you to try out. Instead of capturing this pawn, leading to the previous variation we have just covered, you may also capture this pawn on d4. What can they do? Well, surprisingly, Stockfish actually recommends this pawn to be pushed forward. What's the catch here? Well, if they take this pawn, it allows you to play d5, and as we know, usually, if you manage to play this move, it clears all your troubles. You gain a tempo, you're going to get back this pawn, life's good. Therefore, they do not want to allow that, and that's why this move pawn e5 is really challenging. They're trying to blockade your pawn, maintain this active diagonal for their bishop, and just, you know, also not let you bring the knight out, and they say, you know, like, your position is compromised, it's not easy for you to develop. What do you do then? Well, you still play pawn d5, hitting the bishop. If it goes away, great for you. But it's better for white to capture, keeping the diagonal open for their bishop. Now you recapture, and as they castle, strictly speaking, your position is quite vulnerable, because indeed your king is exposed. They can also deliver this check, but you cover, and although you've got an extra pawn, you can't castle due to this diagonal being controlled. So yeah, it's a little bit shaky, but nevertheless, this is actually a pretty cool trap. Because in this position, the most played move, I believe, as well as the most aggressive move, is knight to g5, trying to exploit your weaknesses straight away, with either jumping with a knight with a fork, or maybe jumping with the bishop right here, going after your king. Feels like you're in trouble. But there is a very nice refutation. You do the same to them. You play knight to g4, something that they did not expect, threatening queen h2 mate. I mean, it's not mate yet, but definitely is going to be extremely dangerous for them. So what can they do now? g3 is a potential option, but it weakens a bunch of squares around their king. You could go, you know, knight e5, for instance, hitting this bishop, you know, and it's all shaky. You can even sometimes play b5 and then develop your bishop right here on the next move. So it's actually pretty good for you. Now, the move which seems to be consolidating everything for white is the move pawn f4. Because now, not only they blocked out your queen, they also took away this square, so your knight can never go there. It looks like knight f7 is going to be crushed on the next move, and you're going down. But that's a false impression, as always in the Rousseau Gambit, because you're going to play d3, this beautiful move. They can't realize what's the point yet, but if they capture this pawn, or basically do anything, let's say this move, or virtually any other move, it opens up this diagonal, and you're going to take advantage of this with this check. They can't easily cover with the bishop because you control this square. And if the king moves, you then continue with knight f2 check. And after the king moves, you might have seen this tactical pattern before. You go knight h3 with a double attack. The king can't go here because of queen f2 mate. Therefore, the only thing they can do is king to h1, which leads to that smothered checkmate pattern. You sacrifice the queen, and then, once the door is shut, you go knight to f2 with this beautiful checkmate. The next trap is super simple, and yet statistically 8% of players here will decide to defend this pawn by going knight to c3, which fails to this trade, followed by d5 with a double attack, and they're going to lose one of their pieces. Moving on to the next trap, another natural way for white to guard this pawn would be to play pawn to d3. In this case, there are two really good variations for black. I'll show you both of them. You can choose whichever one you love more. One of them is a tricky move, bishop c5. You're kind of playing similar to the Italian game, but you have this pawn on f5, which provokes your opponent to see that you're doing something weird. You've got this weak diagonal, very close to your king, and it's really tempting for them to jump with their knight forward, attacking you, kind of like they do in the fried liver attack. But this is actually a wrong idea. Now, you play f4, a very counterintuitive move, which breaks the connection between their bishop and knight, making their knight vulnerable. But they're happy, they were going to go here anyway, and they think that they're about to win the game. It's not true, because after queen h4, you rush into your own counterattack, and actually, in most cases, white is going down badly. Stockfish says that it's about equal, but realistically, black's got 75% win rate, because again, your opponents are having a really hard time defending their position. Now, this pawn is attacked. What can they do? Guarding it with a queen is probably one of the worst options. You can hit it by the knight, or you can even play d5, and after white captures it, bishop g4 just traps the queen. g3 is a better try, but it doesn't solve all of white's problems, because you keep infiltrating with queen h3, queen g2, hitting this pawn, hitting the rook, knight d4, knight f3, all that stuff, so it's still pretty dangerous and certainly not easy for white to handle. The most played move by white right here is simply to castle, trying to play this standard move, and they're hoping that their king is now safe and they're going to win your rook on the next move. And you can welcome them to do so. You can just develop your knight here or here, doesn't matter, and once the rook is captured, knight g4 totally overwhelms white. That's what they did not expect. Now you threaten this, queen takes h2 checkmate, and also you have really strong pressure to these two pawns of their castle, and they have no defense. h3 is the move to stop this checkmate, but then you take knight takes f2, hit the queen, open this diagonal for a bishop, and that's the beginning of the end. They have to give up the rook. Now you come with this check, the king needs to move, and there is a forcing win here for you. You play f3 first, striking right here. You threaten to checkmate them. They can't capture this one because of queen g1, sneaky checkmate. If pawn takes, there's a very useful idea, an attacking pattern in the Rousseau Gambit. It's when you play d5. You wish to sacrifice a pawn to speed up your attack. You wish to bring this bishop into play with a tempo. That's the whole point of this move d5. You attack the bishop, and after they do whatever to guard this, now you've got this bishop active and you can bring it into play straight away, and white is defenseless. You have all these threats, and let's say something like this might happen. The next trap is really subtle and nice, because initially you seem to play standard moves. You go here knight f6, just developing, putting pressure right here. If they still try to do this thing, you then go d5 to break this diagonal. After they capture, go knight e5, kind of similar to the classical variation of the two knights game. You hit this bishop, they go bishop b5 check. So far it looks like just more or less standard thing, very similar to the main line of the two knights game. It's just that you have this pawn on f5. And so far, it looks like both sides play more or less logical moves. You play h6 to kick this knight out, they move it back, as well as attack this pawn, so you defend it, then they castle, you do the same, and this makes your opponent feel that they're out of danger, that they're just playing normal developing moves. But this position is really tricky. Stockfish tells you that white is a little bit better, but they suggest the move pawn to b4, which is super counterintuitive, like it allows you to capture this pawn, and probably no human would play this. But if white plays something like rook e1, I think it's the most played move, or knight to c3, all that stuff fails to pawn e4. You attack the knight. After the trade, the knight still needs to move, and once it moves, here comes the great gift sacrifice, and this is what your opponent did not expect. Bishop takes h2, wins the game, all of a sudden, out of a blue clear sky. The king needs to take it. Now knight g4 counts with a check, and if you're familiar with the Greek gift sacrifice, that is it. The king needs to move, queen h4, and now there is no defense for them. Queen h2 is coming later with queen h1. Also you hit this square, and as well as your rook is coming into play, and white is defenseless. There is a doubt that you may have about this position, because people ask me about this all the time. Igor, how about white capturing this knight? So you'll have to move the rook and lose the right to castle. Like, that's a very simple way for white to mess up your position. It's not really true, because just think about this. In case of this trade, white is going to trade off their best, most active piece that attacks this vulnerable diagonal for your passive knight on g8, and white needs to spend some time doing so. This clearly is a step in the wrong direction, actually, so if they're going to capture it, great, that is already wrong. Moreover, in this position, they usually follow up with one more mistake, basically the initial starting trap of the Rousseau Gambit, when they accept the bait, because it allows the push e4. Now this knight needs to go, we know that there are no convenient squares for them to move forward, they'll have to drive back. And now they're perfectly passive after, a couple moves in the game. Now, the only hope they have here is this check queen h5, which is yet another step in the wrong direction. That would be that typical early queen attack, kind of like in the scholar's checkmate, when they're totally passive but are trying to attack you with a single queen. And if your opponent's idea is bad, such as in this case, there is no need to stop it. We can welcome it. We can go d5, just aiming to get this pawn back. And if they play queen h5 check, most of them will, you go g6 with a counterattack after the trade. Actually, your rook all of a sudden becomes pretty active along this file. Your opponents, though, are still optimistic because they think, hey, I totally erased your kingside, I'm now attacking the rook. life's good. Which is, of course, very far from the truth. Because you go queen g5, guard this rook, and simultaneously hit this pawn on g2. We have seen this attacking pattern before. It's not even the pawn, it's even more so the rook on h1, right? And then the knight, and then the king, and everything. And if white guards it anyhow, there is, once again, a very sudden trap. There are so many of them here in the Rousseau Gambit. This queen on h7 is kind of in the middle of your army. And you can trap it. You can go rook h6, hit in the queen, and after it moves right here, there is no way out. You go bishop d6, and all of a sudden the queen is trapped. While the Rousseau Gambit, of course, is risky, if you're well prepared, it is far riskier for your opponents. A quick reminder that our Black Friday offers are going to expire within just a few days, so if you're interested to level up your chess, it's better to take advantage of them right now by clicking the link somewhere on the screen or down below in the description. And of course, if you have any questions about the Rousseau Gambit, feel free to let me know in the comments below.